Hey everyone, this is Oscar from Underdog, and let's talk a little bit more about chord progressions. I don't know if you saw my last video, but in that video I made the point that a chord progression is the emotional scaffolding of your song. If you choose a good chord progression with a certain emotion, and then you program a whole bunch of synthesizers that take into account that chord progression, then when all those synthesizers play together, they're going to tell the story, the emotional story of that chord progression harmoniously. They're going to sound good together and they're going to deliver the right emotional impact that you designed originally when you chose an appropriate chord progression. So a chord progression is not just a couple of chords played by an instrument. It is, in fact, the choice of emotional scaffolding, the emotional skeleton of your whole song. And once you implement that in all the synthesizers will have the right impact. Fair enough. When I teach music theory for electronic music, this is really sort of the end goal where I want to reach at. I want people to understand what a chord progression is, why you should care about it, and how to implement it. However, once you get to this point, you might think a little bit too theoretically. You might think that music theory has the answer to designing a good chord progression for your song. But the problem with that is music is an emotional experience. It's an art form that speaks to your heart more than to your head. So if you're trying to use your head too much, then you're not going to be really listening or emotionally available to the feeling of your own production. So what am I going to recommend? I recommend that if you want to use a chord progression, you have to do something called shopping for emotions. And shopping for emotions, it's a workflow idea, let's say, where you put yourself in a situation that you can audition a whole bunch of different chords in rapid succession and see how they make you feel. So you're changing chords and then you're listening to your heart. Sounds a bit cheesy. You're listening to your emotional response to those chords to know if those feelings are appropriate for the song you want to make. And there are a few different ways to shop for emotion. And one of them that immediately people are going to be suggesting in the comments is just learn to play an instrument. We are musicians after all. Learn how to play an instrument so that you can then play that instrument, often a piano or a guitar or classic ones for this, and try out different chord progressions and then just decide on something for your production. That's all good and well. However, a lot of people come into music production or electronic music production not necessarily through the classic learning an instrument route. And we don't want to be gatekeeping. Music is for everyone. We don't want to only limit music to the people who are musically trained. We want to make things more accessible for people. And so nowadays we have some tools that allow us to shop for emotions in different ways. And one of those tools that I want to explore together today is called a chord sequencer. Let's have a look at that together. All right, let's talk about chord sequencers. There are a few different tools out there that let you choose chords from a palette of chords and quickly audition those chords and then lets you sequence those chords in an easy way that fits into your workflow. You might recall that I'm a brand ambassador for Reason Studios, which is a piece of software that exists as a DAW standalone or as a plugin in any other DAW. And so I use it as a plugin inside of Ableton. And Reason Studios have just come out with a new device called the Chord Sequencer. And so let me show you this concept using Reason's Chord Sequencer. By the way, Reason is available as a subscription that you can get a discount on using the link below, so you can try it for a month or two, see if it works for your workflow, and make up your own mind if it's something for you. Follow the affiliate link below to get yourself a sweet little discount. So like I said, a chord sequencer gives you a palette of chords that you can easily audition. In this case, 16 chords that offer you a certain kind of emotional color. For example, the default chords here sound like this. And like in the previous video, notice the feeling of the chord, especially when the chord changes. Don't listen to the sound design because I'm only playing sine waves with this. Later on, the idea is that we would put a different synthesizer on there to create the sound design. But right now we're looking at the emotional journey of the chords. And once you've clicked around a bit here and you find some chord transitions that you like, what you then do is you drag those chords down into the sequencer and make yourself a sequence. And when making a chord sequence, think about a few different things. First of all, how long is the chord progression going to be? Like how many bars in total, right? Then how many chords are there going to be in your chord progression? If you're making pop music, 4 is a very common amount. If you're making electronica, 3 is a very common amount. If you're making house or techno, 2 is a very common amount. So think first what's appropriate for your genre, and then choose the number of chords that's appropriate. And then you have to basically divide the amount of time that you've got into those chords. And it doesn't have to be equal. You don't have to do, for example, 1 chord per bar. That's a very standard amount, but you could change the chord a little bit sooner or a little bit later than the bar, so that the chord change happens at a moment that's slightly syncopated compared to your main groove. Now, my example here just used classic pop chords. However, you can choose a different chord palette, let's say, that's included in a plugin like this. In fact, I'm biased because I submitted a few chord palettes to this, so I'm going to suggest using the one called Rave Tears. And so clicking around in this one sounds a bit like this. It's a chord palette that immediately leads to relatively melancholic, a little bit melodramatic feelings, which I think can work quite powerfully if you think about it in the context of like an up-tempo, new school rave kind of context. And like I said, these sine waves are only there to tell us the emotional story as the chords change, right? The next step is sound design, and as you might have seen in this video, what we can do with chords is we can just break it straight back up into melodies using arpeggiators, and then those melodies are still going to have that emotional feeling of the chord progression. So imagine this is our chord progression. Pretty simple sound, right? And then we break it apart with an arpeggiator. You see how this could be the main riff of a dance tune, for example? Let's push this idea a little bit further. Using that same chord palette, here's a different progression. For example. Okay? You notice how this feels, right? Cool. Now, let's put in the Reason arpeggiator with that. So we're just going to break those chords apart again using the built-in dual arpeggiator in Reason. Which is cool because it lets you mute steps. This is something that the Ableton ARP won't do for you. You can't mute certain steps in the sequence, and that limits the versatility of it to be able to build up melodies over a chord progression, right? So we've got this little chord progression, which is cute, but let's do a different sound design for this. Cool. In this case, I've got myself the Repro 1, and it's going through a whole bunch of things, notably the Decimort Bit Crusher, and a couple of lush other effects. All right. Now the beautiful thing about these chords, of course, is that you can export the chords and use them in other synths to layer them on top of each other. For example, here I use some free string samples using the Sine Player. Now this is a bit too dense for my liking. I'm just going to remove a whole bunch of the chords to just get that little accent every now and then. That's good enough for me, but now you can see it's very easy to program multiple harmonious things because we know the chord progression, we know the notes it's going to play. And then you add a whole bunch of other techno elements, and here we go. Oh, and as a little technical tip, by the way, in Ableton, if you're going to use Reason in this way, it's cool to resample your chords on a new MIDI track. So what you do is you make one MIDI track with the Reason plugin on there. In the plugin, you just select the player device called Chord Sequencer. You don't put anything else on there unless you want to add some more player devices, right? And then in Ableton, you make a second MIDI track. And as the input of that second MIDI track, you select that Reason channel. And then in the second little box, you select the Reason plugin there. If that's not showing up for you, it's probably because you're using the audio unit, not the VST. So be sure to use the VST. You set monitoring to in and you just hit record, and suddenly your chords are right there for you to use. And you can then copy those chords over and feed them into different synthesizers. Or like I did here, I fed them into some different string samples. If you like this kind of vibey physical techno, go follow my project called Torque on SoundCloud and Instagram. The handles are below. If you want to learn music production in a more complete way, go follow my Foundations of Electronic Music course. Thank you to Reason Studios for bringing out such an awesome device. Come show us on the Discord channel what you did with this. Like the video, subscribe to show me some love and support the channel. And until next time, stay producing, be good to one another, and take care. Bye-bye.